So finally, we have Marek Reuter, and Marek is a research affiliate in the Accounting Frameworks platform at Misum, as well as an assistant professor at the Department of Accounting at SSE. And he will be presenting on environmental management and conceptions of responsible organisational self and organisational identity perspective. So welcome, Marek, and I'll now pass things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this lovely introduction, and also from my side, of course, a very warm welcome to the Misum Annual Forum, and in particular to the last presentation now of this session here, which is essentially about how organizational members understand their organization, their very own organization, as a responsible entity or a not so responsible entity. And in particular, I'm very interested with this research on how those conceptions of responsible organizational self are now affected by regulatory frameworks, by the contemporary regulatory frameworks that we see in nowadays times. So in Margot's tradition, I will continue also with a qualitative case study. And we as qualitative researchers, one thing that we are oftentimes on the lookout for is to find case organizations that are in some way particular or special, so not the average hospital in this sense. And the particular thing, or the interesting thing about the case organization that I will present today about is that it has established, that the members sort of have established throughout its history this narrative of being, their company being a green pioneer or a pioneer in corporate environmentalism. And this is interesting because it offers us then the opportunity to actually study how the contemporary regulatory frameworks and those green practices, how they are implicated in this narrative of responsible organizational self. And I'm looking at a particular practice here, of course, empirically, and that is what I've been studying is standards-based or certification-based environmental management systems. And these systems are, of course, a special type of practice that corporations engage in, a quite prominent one, I would say, because almost all organizations, almost all companies nowadays have some sort of environmental management system implemented, and they are based on those standards such as ISO 14001 or the Eco Management Scheme of the European Union. So, but I think we heard about other practices, for example, TCFD nowadays, and I think the learnings from this study can also be applied to those other practices. And I will explain in a second why I think this is the case, because when we look at those certification practices and those standards in nowadays times, then they are very much based on a certain nature of environmental management. And other researchers have thought about this a lot, and they have concluded that, okay, so what we see nowadays is that we have undergone a managerial turn in corporate environmentalism. So what does that mean? That means essentially when corporations come and implement those standards or those certifications, then this requires them to manage the environment according to highly technocratic, managerialist, and also market-based ideals. So what does that mean? So I will give you a few examples here of what I mean with this managerial turn. So first of all, those standards make corporate environmentalism, they render corporate environmentalism something that is subject to auditability. Yeah? So the organization that implements an environmental management system will be audited by an external auditor. Now that means that it also needs to be fit for audit internally. So those environmental management systems, what they do is they bring regulation onto the organizational level and make it an issue of internal self-assessment and internal control and internal self-inspection and these things. And this brings along, well, this restructures organizations then as auditable entities, which of course is not a neutral process, but it changes the organization. Then we also have, when we implement those standards, we have a certain type of expertise and a certain type of professionalism attached to this. That is very much, when you want to put it generally, that is very much related to administrative work, but also of a very technical nature when we think about things like energy management or waste management and so on. And then we have as a last point, we have a certain notion of environmental performance that comes with these standards. And that is one that is very much geared towards a numerical representation of environmental performance. So for example, when you implement standards, environmental management system standards, then these require the organizations to engage in environmental achievements that are objective and measurable, right? And for this to achieve, you need this numerical representation of environmental performance. And also, it's not only numerical in the sense that we have quantitative environmental performance, but it also means that we can translate them into monetary terms, right? And yeah, there are quite prominent phenomena then that we see nowadays, such as, for example, the business case and sustainability or eco-efficiency that today's companies very much almost have taken for granted, right? So, and there is a lot of excellent research, as I indicated, about this managerial turn, and what this research tends to say, it criticizes it, the managerial turn, for sidelining or circumventing or even crowding out, in some sense, alternative value conceptions of environmental responsibility, right? But there is one thing, at least in the environmental accounting and auditing literature, is that this criticism has been very much on the macro level. So, for example, there is studies looking at how the audit profession sort of shapes and takes over and captures this discourse with the managerialist and market-based ideals, right? Or other studies are on a philosophical level. But there is not so much studies looking at really the organizational level and how these value-subverting tendencies really play out on the level of the organizational meaning systems. And this is where the study then comes in, where it is interesting of this case organization that has this responsible self. So what do I mean with the responsible self, really? So when we think about organizations and corporations nowadays, then we don't really hesitate to talk about them as actors, as sort of actors that possess some sort of sovereign capability to act, but also to be responsible and accountable for those actions, right? And we also don't really hesitate to ascribe those organizations moral traits or a certain set of values, much like we would do with human beings, actually, with persons, right? And in times in which corporations now are increasingly seen to play a very important role in the big ecological challenges of our time, those moral traits and values oftentimes take reference to the organizational responsibility with respect to environmentalism, right? So, and this may go so far that also the internal members of the organization come to think of their organization really possessing some sort of green identity, yeah? And this is really much the case. So what I use as a conceptual framework, as a conceptual lens in my study is literature on organizational identity. So there is a broad tradition on investigating where organizational identities come from, how they emerge and how they change over time. So I don't want to dig too deep into this now, but a few things are important. So one thing is that those identities oftentimes reside or are embedded in practice, and not any type of practice, but practices that are essentially perceived by members as being central, distinctive, and relatively enduring over time for the organization. And of course, the identities that emerge from this, they are sort of, in the first place, a cognitive phenomenon, because they are in the heads of those members in the first place. But what people tend to do is they tend to tell stories or narratives about those identities. And those narratives are what makes the identities then observable and knowable and also studyable. So this will be the empirical focus of this investigation. So a few words about the case organization. So I lovingly termed it in the paper Certificorp. And Certificorp is a medium-sized company in a European country, and it's active in the chemical sector, and it produces paints and coatings. And as I indicated before, the special thing is that based on a corporate strategy of green product and process innovation, this company then developed this identity of being a green pioneer, yeah, in its particular sector. So I had quite good access to this company to conduct this qualitative work. So that means that I did not only conduct interviews, but I also was provided a desk in the open space office where those environmental managers were working, so I could directly observe them doing their work with their daily struggles and achievements and so on. But I also had the chance to then go to lunches or have the coffee breaks, or an occasional walk even on the company facilities with some other members from the organization. So overall, I would say I got a quite good understanding of the organizational life at Certificorp, and in particular also try to understand a little bit the cultural belief system there. So the identity narrative of being a green pioneer is of course has many different facets and many different episodes that I can't really dig into. But what is important to understand that this was sort of emerging in an industry context in the 70s, 80s, where the chemical industry had a very bad and dirty image, right? Not environmental friendly at all, in a sense. And this was also the case for the paint and coating sector, because all those paints and coatings were based on solvents, right? And Certificorp was, at least they claim this in those narratives, was one of the first companies who really came up with water, with a full product palette of water-based coatings. And they were pioneering this within their sector, which was, and this is important to understand, not an unrisky thing, because it was very uncertain and it was received a lot of backlash also from competitors and from suppliers and so on. So one thing that is very important about this identity is that it really emerged from two internal champions, you could say. And one is the founding father of the company, and the other one is a chemist specialized in water-based coatings. And those really are very prominent in those narratives, because they really took those momentous character-defining decisions that really coined the strategy later, or enabled even the strategy to be this green pioneer. And it's very interesting to look at this narrative. When you analyze it, then you can see that those momentous decisions and actions of those internal protagonists, they sort of coined or infused the organization a certain set of values and moralities that sort of laid out what it means to act in character also as a green pioneer, right? And there was this narrative constructed out around of this. And one example is, for example, that environmentalism is something that you really pursue with conviction, yeah? That you believe in, that it is a goal worth pursuing in its own end, sort of. And even if the outcome is a little bit uncertain, we sort of stay on this path and pursue it still, because we believe in it internally. Yeah? So, and this narrative is was the source of a lot of organizational identification for the members, and a lot of pride as well, and motivation to really become part of what those members thought was sort of a noble project of organizational becoming in the end there. So, but then as the narrative, or as time went on and we went into the 90s, sort of we had this new conception of corporate environmentalism emerging here. And this is essentially then what I explained before as the managerial turn, where you had all those certification practices and standards suddenly come up. And in many ways, as an act in character, this green pioneer Certificorp then became what, and this is the words of those members, a first mover or a champion in those certification practices. So they were the first ones to adopt certain new standards in the chemical industry or in their paint and coating sector, and they adopted a lot of those things. So basically everything that came up as a pioneer, they needed to do as well. So it helped them to perpetuate this identity, especially in times where those water-based coatings became a little bit more the norm in the industry instead of the exception. So it was a little bit more difficult to compete on the basis of this. So it was very nice, because those certification practices, they gave Certificorp also novel notions of environmental performance that they could excel in and perpetuate their identity. So for example, they became a champion in environmental performance measurement. Yeah, they had these very sophisticated systems in place to measure their environmental footprints, and they were praising themselves that they are the only company back in the days, at least of their size, that knows their CO2 footprint in these sort of things, right? So, and they also had this very sophisticated system of structural self-observation that allowed them then to master recertification processes with ease, and they also got a lot of praise from external auditors and consultants from there. So really, this helped them to continue their identity. And when you looked at this, when you talked to members, on the first side at least, this narrative was very much coined by a rhetoric of success. But digging deeper into this rhetoric, into this narrative, one could easily find out then that, or one easily recognized that this narrative was really a lot subject to fragility also. Yeah? And this has a lot to do with the way that this company needed to practice corporate environmentalism now, which was not always necessarily incoherent with the historically rooted narrative of what it means to act in character as the green pioneer, as this pioneer. So for example, the system of structured self-observation and self-inspection came with a lot of documentation efforts. So there were a lot of policies, and especially with the broad range of standards that Certificate had implemented, this was a lot of extra work that a lot of members then in the end, when they were honest, were saying, well, is this really, this amounts to a little bit of a meaningless bureaucracy, what we are doing here? Are we doing this really for the sake of the environment, or are we doing this just to get just another standard and another label that we can put on our website here? And they were saying, okay, so this is very much different from how we used to do this back in the days, right? Another example is that it's also changed the notion of environmental expertise, where people said, and even long-standing employees said, well, I used to be very much involved in this as a strategic topic, but nowadays this is all about energy efficiency, eco-efficiency, waste management. It's very technical, and this is their word. I cannot really understand what's going on here. So they had this disengagement, a little bit of disidentification also with with corporate environmentalism here. And one thing that particularly stood out was the issue of decision making, because Certificorp very much bought into this idea of the business case of sustainability. So they did a lot of environmental performance measurements. So they had these numerical monetary representations, and it allowed them, of course, to take decisions in a sort of novel ecologic rationality manner, which also looks at the environment not only in the environmental terms, but also in economic terms. What this meant is that you could integrate it in traditional return on investment calculations. But this also meant that then in the end, a lot of investment appraisals also got rejected, of course, because they don't pay off financially in a certain time span. And there was a lot of projects that sort of, or ideas that came up by environmental managers where they really put a lot of hard blood inside, and those being rejected after a lot of work then led to a lot of frustration, and the people really questioning, okay, we are just doing this nowadays for the sake of financial gain and not really in the sense of how we have been practicing it as a pioneer back in the days. So what happened then as a conclusion, in a sense, is that people disidentified on the one hand with their own identity. They believed, okay, so this is something that we sort of lost along the way, apparently, but they also disidentified with the novel practices and with the idea of corporate environmentalism as such in a little bit, which is kind of a sad story because they got so much pride and so much motivation out of it in the past, right? And so what can we learn overall from the story of Certificorp here? Now is the question. Well, I would say that we can learn that companies or organizations in general have local practices to engage with the environment. And these practices can infuse the organization with a certain set of very idiosyncratic values and moralities, right? And those values and moralities, they then become implicated also, or become constructed in organizational narratives of the responsible self. And they spell out what it means to act in character as a certain organization. Now, the contemporary practices and frameworks of environmental management are, on the other hand, of an abstract nature. They're often disembedded nature, right? They didn't emerge locally, so they are not necessarily in coherence with those internal narratives of organizational self. So they might require organizations to act actually out of character then in this sense. So overall, the study then theoretically shows the temporal identity complexities that may come along when organizations have to adopt institutionalized practices here. And what we can learn from, or what researchers studying the managerial turn in corporate environmentalism can learn from this study is, I think, that they need to look at the organization level, meaning level complexities that can occur when those practices are implemented here. With this, I want to end, and yes, as the other researchers, I also invite you. I'm always happy to talk about this study. I really love it. It's one of my favorite projects. So if you have any comments, criticism, insights, please don't hesitate to contact me. And now I'm looking forward to some questions of you. Thank you.
So thank you, Marek. That was another great presentation and really got me thinking as well about environmental management and our responsibilities. And I've got a couple of questions for you, and I've got some questions coming through, so I hope that's okay.
Yes.
So I'll start with a big question, I suppose, but by problematizing a managerial approach towards corporate environmentalism, your talk kind of at least implicitly also problematizes contemporary environmental regulatory frameworks. So what would you say can policymakers learn from your study?
Yes, I think the criticism is quite, yeah, it is implicit because it's not a study about policy, but it is quite explicit in a sense as well, I think, from this. So this is, of course, an important issue, I think. What can regulators learn? And I think what regulators can learn in general is that they also need to be attentive of the sort of like softer implications of their policies that they construct, right? So, and in particular now, since this study is about organizational identity, I think regulators need to be aware that organizations and their members in particularly, they construct identities based on the practices that they engage in, right? So what I would wish to see is regulations that sort of take this into account and that also facilitate maybe green, strong, significant identities that give pride, that give ambition and motivation and passion to the internal members. Because I think this is really what is needed now, since apparently we ascribe corporations a really big role in tackling the big environmental challenges that we face in our society. And I think what it needs for this are really these strong identities. So this is very important. And it is, of course, a sort of difficult thing. But I think when we look at the literature, seeing what constitutes identity, so this is really something that is really central, practices that are central for the members, and not only central in the sense of that they sort of affect the corporate strategy, but also that people find them meaningful in this sense for their organizational life.
Okay, thank you. Another question, to what extent are the narratives and the corporate identity corporate, and to what extent are they the narratives and wish for identities in the environment management department?
So there was the...
To what extent are the narratives and the corporate identity corporate, and to what extent are they the narratives and wish for identities in the environment management department?
Okay. So I mean, I could see this a little bit. There are different identity narratives around, and that's a very good question that we, I think, need to distinguish upon. So, and the identity literature actually helps us here because it distinguishes a little bit between image and identity, and also and the image is more like the external appearance, which is oftentimes more the formalized accounts of organizational identity, right? When you would look at sustainability reports or something like that, then you would find those there, I think. So these are and these are coined by a lot of coherence, and they depict the organization in a very environmental friendly champion fashion, right? Whereas when we look at the internal narratives, right, those that the members really construct and that they nurture among themselves, they are coined by much more ambiguity in this sense and a lot more discoherence and tension as well. So I think, there is a long tradition in the accounting literature actually to look at those sustainability reports. But what is also necessary is to look at, okay, so how do these practices really internally coin those?
Which of course is where your qualitative work especially is kicking in, isn't it?
Yeah, we need qualitative research for this.
We certainly do. Right, hang on. And another question we've got is a kind of continuation of that question, I suppose. What is the variation of narratives and identity conceptions across the different parts of the organization?
The variation? There was a big variation, actually. And of course, I mean, when I write this paper, what I was struggling with is, okay, so what is the real, the official, the real true narrative now? And of course, there are probably as many versions as there are people in these organizations about, and even in different situations, those same people may tell the same narrative in different ways, right? Depending on where they talk to. But what we could see is that there is also, those identity narratives are very much implicated in organizational politics in a sense, that some people have an interest of sort of maintaining the past, and those were, for example, the environmental managers, because for them these narratives were also a tool to lobby for their own projects, right? Because when something got rejected because of financial means, they were mobilizing these rhetorics and saying, okay, so but do we actually act in the sense of what our identity is as this company? So there was a big variation, whereas others were more interested in another viewpoint, and they said, well, this identity is sort of something of the past, right? We need to move on. And especially, it was interesting to see that this moving on was then also implicated in going beyond corporate environmentalism and going towards sustainability, so which has different pillars of value then incorporated.
Okay. And another question, if you're okay.
Yes.
So your case study's focus is inherently internal, in that it concentrates how specifically organisation internals perceive the implementation of standards-based environmental accounting and auditing practices. So can we assume that such practices have similar effects externally and, say, on the broader societal level? And I think you've touched on that, but if you could kind of expand.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we really think about those standards, those environmental management system standards, then they have a big external function in the sense of that they signal something, that the environment is managed properly here according to those abstract ideals of the managerial term in corporate environmentalism. So as I said before already, we definitely need to distinguish between the external and the internal. And as I said before, externally, I think in the image that those standards construct, we have very coherent pictures of the organization and how they engage in corporate environmentalism, whereas internally, this is then a lot more plurivocal in this sense.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so thank you, Marek, for sharing your thoughts here. Much appreciated. And thank you as well for teasing out the questions. That was good.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.